Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming and welcome to this very, very special event, a book launch for Louise and Daniel's fantastic book, Queering Higher Education. I'm Kelly Coate. I'm going to be doing the complicated job of trying to chair this event with a lovely online audience of about 10 participants so far and this lovely in-person audience that we have here. Let me just explain how it's going to work, what the running order is, and then I'll just say a few words and we'll launch into it. What we're going to do is hear from the two authors and our guest speakers, David Rubain and Emily Henderson, and we're delighted that you could come and join us for this. Each of the panel are going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to have about a half an hour for a question and answer session, which I'm looking forward to. And again, I'm going to try to navigate the online questions and the in-person questions. If you're online, I'm afraid you can only type your question into the chat. If you're here in person, you'll either need to use this microphone so that the online people can hear you, or you'll need me to act as a conduit. But we'll figure it out. But I'm really looking forward to the discussion and to hearing from the authors and the panelists, because I think for those of you who've got your copy, and if you don't have a copy, you'll need to get one soon, but you'll know what a special and unique book this is. And there is nothing else like it about higher education. And I've been researching higher education for decades now, and we all know just how atheoretical a lot of the literature is out there. Louise and her colleagues have obviously been making a huge difference to that, but this is like setting the bar even higher. It was an amazing read for me because, as I think I said to Louise, it felt like the book I needed to read but didn't know I needed to read it. And one of the things that they do so articulately and powerfully is bring the affective into an analysis of the current higher education climate. And I had a very affective response reading it. It kind of touched many nerves and was also challenging in a really fantastic intellectual way. So I'm really grateful to you both for writing it. So I think we should just get straight into things. And Louise, you are going to start us off.
Yes. Okay, could I have my PowerPoint? Great. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for coming. May I have the clicker, please? I'm absolutely delighted to see you all here, and I'm going to just do a bit of an overview of what we were trying to achieve. What is queer? A lot of people, when we said we were writing this book, thought we would be talking about LGBT students, staff, and all the problems, etc. No, that's not the focus. We're looking at queer as a verb as well as a noun. And we're looking at practice, action, resistance, and critical edge. Queer, as we all know, originally signified injurious speech. If you wanted to really insult somebody, you called them queer. And the whole appropriation of the term was about recasting abuse as affirmation. But what's important about queer is that it decentralizes. It disrupts and deconstructs understandings of power. It renders the normal and familiar strange and unstable. It theorizes exclusion and marginalization. It crosses, destabilizes, resists, and transitions borders and boundaries. And a point that I really want to stress right from the beginning is that it's not just about identity and sexual orientation and the hetero-homo divide. It's about disrupting binaries, borders, etc. It's a theoretical apparatus, not just an identity. Now, it's often been seen in response to the normalization of heterosexuality or heteronormativity. So queer theory originally aimed to expose and interrogate the heterosexual colonization of social reality. Queer, yes, is an identity category, but it's a hermeneutic tool of discursive deconstruction. It's a rejection of the here and now and exploring potentiality or concrete possibility for difference. We don't always have to do things the way that they're being done now. We can start to disrupt, to destabilize, and ask some difficult questions. So what do we mean by queering higher education? Are we saying, let's get more LGBT people in? No, that's just part of it. We're saying, let's queer the policies, let's disorder, let's disrupt, let's dismantle the binary and normative logics. And challenging binaries is an essential part of queering any particular phenomenon. So what we're not saying is, let's carve out more space for marginalised communities, let's have tokenised days, months, let's all wear rainbow laces on a Tuesday kind of thing. We're not saying that. No, we're not saying that. We're saying, let's actually challenge some of the norms, the binaries, the boundaries, the common sense knowledge that circulate in higher education studies and policy. So normativity is very much part of the assemblage of the university. It's full of dichotomous logics and argumentation. And what we've tried to do is to queer, reformat, and subvert abjection. Because often the only identity that's allowed to the marginalised communities is one of abjection. And we have to occupy that space in order to be able to engage with higher education. We also tried to explore heteronormal dynamics and binary logics that play out micro-politically. And when I use the term micro-politically, we mean in everyday transactions of power. The coalitions, the exclusions, the networks, the throwaway remarks, etc. So global higher education, we hear a lot about it in macro policy terms, but there's very, very little about how power operates micro-politically. So we've tried to offer some provocations, so we're well known for that, for how queer theory might be applied to the field of higher education studies. So looking, for example, at regimes of truth relating to gender, to post-colonialism and socioeconomic privilege and disadvantage. And some of the policy domains we've looked at. The global pandemic certainly queered higher education. It challenged boundaries. It breached the private-public boundary. It had a whole lot of implications for reinforcing normativities. You know, all the discussions, the jokes about Zoom with babies on women's laps, and cats, etc., and a whole range of issues about normative care and homeschooling, etc. And crisis management also surfaced a lot of norms. What was valued? What wasn't valued? The digital economy, you think, well, what's that got to do with queer? It's all about IT. But yet again, it is about breaching boundaries. It's creating a huge boundary between being progressive and being in deficit. And it's massively privatized and marketized. And within the digital economy, a lot of norms are transmitted. The affirmative action, which Daniel knows a great deal about, studied for decades, we talk more about widening participation in Britain, but elsewhere in the world it's affirmative action. And that relies very much on boundaried identities of working class, of middle class, of male, female, etc., whatever the particular signifier is. And often this massively reproduces notions of abjection, that if you think of the kind of language that's used to describe working class communities in widening participation, it's all about raising aspiration. It's all suggesting that somehow working class communities lack ambition, they're in deficit, they have to be worked on ontologically, affectively, etc. And then another area that we've done a lot of work on in our centre is internationalisation, which is full of boundaries and borders, and the national versus the international. And the research that we've conducted in CHEER seems to suggest that there are a lot of norms that are being transmitted via the internationalisation discourse, and a lot of narratives that are being suppressed. Gender is a very good example. And then the women in leadership is something I've been working on for a very long time, all around the world, and it often is based on heteronormative assumptions about lifestyles, childcare, and women being compared always with men. And in many countries, the aim is to change the quantitative representation of women in leadership. Now, we've seen this globally with heads of state, etc. And I think it's really important to ask, to go back to that notion of ontology as epistemology. And if you change the bodies, do you change the policies? Do you change the culture, etc.? So there's a lot of concern that women in leadership is just reinforcing norms about heteronormative lifestyles. So, and we've tried to be as international as possible, and we've drawn on empirical data and literature from East and South Asia, Europe, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, we're not here to sell you queer theory. We're not here to market it. We're not here to get you to buy into it. We're very critical, too, of queer theory. And queer theory itself needs to be queered. So can queerness maintain its transgressive potential and avoid being incorporated into neoliberal multiculturalism, into marketisation, the pink pound, etc.? Is it about superficial diversity politics, as we were saying, the rainbow? Is it about effective capitalism? And it's interesting to see how much more literature there is now on this topic, where people's affects, their emotions, their feelings, their responses are manipulated in response to what is perceived as good for the economy. Has queer become just a brand name? Yeah, can anybody and anything call themselves queer now in order to give themselves a bit of an edge? Is it a commodity? Is it linked to patterns of consumption, rainbow capitalism? And I have to remind us that June is Pride Month. Suddenly everything, even the Waitrose order, is covered in rainbow flags, you know, for 1 month. So how do we query ideas about queer inclusive universities and move beyond this rainbow into the critical potentiality of queer perspectives? Why apply it to higher education? It's, as Kelly was saying, it hasn't happened before. It's been slightly applied to schools and to students and staff, but not to higher education policy itself. Why bother? What's the connection? Well, it's important, we think, to identify how norms and binaries are reinforced through discourses, experiences and practices, globally and nationally. Recenter the margin as an analytical vantage point. And to explore the hidden transcripts, and this is really important, and Daniel's going to talk more about this, than the abject spaces of academic life and policy discourses. And most importantly, to highlight the effective and embodied economy in the geopolitics of knowledge, and expose the heterocentricity of the dominant neoliberal university. So, okay, that sounds like a good idea. Why do universities get attacked when they do all that? Well, often it's because it's seen as pinkwashing, which is a nice new term, the politics of visibility. And if you look at some of the main areas of EDI traditionally, gender, for example, something many of us here have worked on, I would question whether feminist struggles in the academy predominantly focus on heteronormative, cis, sexist women, and it's always women in relation to men. And then there's the whole area of trans rights, which is huge at the moment. And one point we make in the book is how can we stop this lining up behind different gangs and the gang warfare? How do we not get sucked into that? Because whose interest is that serving? That's serving the interests of the dominant groups to set all the marginalised oppressed groups against each other. And my view, and it's been like this for quite a while now, is that I think we should use our significant intellectual capital, just in this room alone, to analyse why there's such a potent, effective charge in this whole debate, in this whole narrative, and not get drawn into another binary. And then the decolonization. How do we avoid homo-nationalism, which many of you will know is about powerful men talking to other powerful men, but using women to justify invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. You know, Britain's got to go and help Afghanistan out because the women are so oppressed there. Yeah, well, they still are. And we were there for quite a long time, I believe. So how do we look at post-colonialism and intersect the race and ethnicity with gender and sexuality? And then social class, which is something we've done a lot of work on in CHEER over the years. How do we move away from these binaries? And Daniel and I have been to conferences all over, haven't we? We've had to listen to people standing up there about these poor, abject working class communities who lack ambition, they're all excluded and poor and exploited, etc. Which is, you know, some of it might be true, but it's a very abject subjectivity. And then set against that is this secure, strategic, self-assured identity of the middle classes. Well, we would say that that could be an unhelpful binary. And then, of course, what Judith Butler called the embarrassed et ceteras, they're all the other protected characteristics that rarely get mentioned. I'm particularly sensitive around age at the moment. If anybody else tells me I look good for my age, I think I should explode. But so we've played with concepts of chrononormativity, for example. What is seen as age appropriate, and how life course is very, very normative and very linear, and what you have to be on a particular trajectory or you are strange. We've also, we're concerned about how disability rarely gets discussed, and there's an equivalent to queer theory, the crip theory, where disability identity is being recast. And all the notions about, you know, able-bodyism, etc. So we're not saying that we want more tolerance. Tolerance, I think, is a highly problematic term. We're not seeking tolerance. We're embracing stigma and disrupting the shame. Okay, well, one of the most commonly used phrases during the pandemic, you need to unmute yourself. How many times have people said that on Zoom meetings? And we're suggesting the same. We're calling for people notice, challenge, and work to dismantle heteronormativity in higher education in all its forms, not just identity politics. Problematize the hooray words, the diversity, the inclusion, merit, internationalization. Unmask the power relations that they serve and reinforce. Queer the academy with new, effective, and political imaginaries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Louise. Fantastic start. Now we're going to hand over to Daniel.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming. Thank you for coming, everybody. I will talk about one of my different lines of my biographical reflections on writing this book, Queering Global Higher Education, and I will center my reflections around the body. So let's start with one of the intellectual beginnings of this book. During the pandemic, I had several online encounters with Louise. Most of them, if not all of them, aimed to do something academically relevant for us. I remember that at the beginning, I wanted to write with Louise a series of articles to be published in major journals. That was a strategy. I don't remember why such a project never occurred, but it never happened. But certainly, the urgency of the pandemic and the ephemeral of life that the pandemic remembers us came with it, bring us some reflections and reconsiderations about our own intellectual priorities. One of the things I remember when I was sharing some initial ideas was the multiple and disorienting hypothesis about almost anything that I was sharing with Louise, and that I was experienced from my own location. At that time, I was living in Chile, participating actively in the intense upheavals, political passions, collective organizing, and thinking about the possibilities of laying out different grounds for emancipatory institutions or politics. While at the same time, they were a strong nationalistic, heteropatriarchal, anti-communist, racist, and authoritarian responses and rearticulation. They are taking place even nowadays in Chile. These developments were going on at the time when, because of the pandemic, the global and the household felt like the same totalizing space, but with a shrinking outside. When fear and care, distance and solidarity were inseparable, and when technological, interspecies, geopolitical, financial, and intimate global forces were governing and forming the folds of our skin, bodies, and anxieties at that time. They were maybe the first hints for me that the world over was folding queer. In which sense? In the sense that they were folding into the unknown, strange, and bizarre, as well as into the disidentification with the social current and into the new social, not yet here, not yet present, but deeply felt. Around that bizarre time, Louise arrived with the idea of this book. This queer folding of the world and my productive failures, trying to read in what was going on, led me to engage with some of the writings of the queer for the working of this book. Through them, I started to think the importance of the constitution and positioning of bodies in the manifestations of the global tendencies in politics of knowledge and normalities around higher education. And the second biographical line of this book that I would like to recognize is linked to my positioning as a subaltern precarity, or precarious subaltern subject. This took place when I came back to the UK 1 year and some months ago, near the never-ending end of this book, while juggling my arrival, life, and labor with a new job as postdoc, and no stable home, and increasing expenses imposed by the border regime of this country. Such condition of precarity, marked by a politics of instability and subalternity, defined one of the central lines that influenced my being when trying to finish this writing. And I would like to think that some of these intensities and tones might be reflected on the pages of this book. By looking back at such condition, I feel that to write a book, as a precarious early career researcher, they call me, you need to silently deviate from and subvert the norms of intellectual labor pervaded by ref imaginaries. What I mean by this, the current framework that assesses the value of our research and where books are in value as important sources of contribution. Today, I'm told that I need to write just articles, papers. Without that resistance, my contribution wouldn't have seen the light, and the experience of writing a book, this is a new experience to me, never materialized. So, what about queering politics, the queering politics of knowledge? Through different queer texts across the humanities and social sciences, a queer politics of knowledge is manifested in a theoretical thrust, fueled by playful dispositions, theoretical disobedience, political commitment, and critical and polemical engagements, aiming to open livable space for those out of norms, forced by norms, and for other emancipatory disidentification with othering and dominance norms. A queer politics of knowledge transpires, in my view, the vital attention given to ordinary affects. Those are often perceived as small, without power, and inconsequential. The promise is to disfigure and short-circuit totalizing discourses, that is, discourses aspiring to have no outside, no alternative, such as those of capitalism, the global, the truth, and the binary. Not yet. No. Yeah. Thanks. We took this politics of knowledge not to invent another anti-sociology or disciplinary approach, but to engage with fruitful critical canons of the social sciences, to problematize mainstream debates around inclusion, epistemic injustice, internationalization, or the digital in higher education. And last but not least, the book is traversed by intense writing. And intense writing is parallel to the idea of intense reading promoted by Gilles Deleuze. By this, Deleuze meant putting our readings in contact with other currents, with what is apparently outside the canons defining the scope of the book. For him, this type of reading was explicitly a reading with love. And I hope that some people can sense some of these intensities when reading the book. As a space of intense reading and writing, the book, this book, poses the question about its capacity to move us in affective terms, but also to move our analytical agencies in political ethical ways. This capacity to move us can be found in the entirety of the book, but also in some poetic articulations of truth in bold and traveling statements, or in the messages between lines expressing desires to expose our academic banality and cynicism when critiques or reparations are funneled into the game to accommodate everything that might be unsettled the master narratives of higher education. Thank you. So, with some of these theoretical and political backgrounds, we wanted to travel the master narratives of the global in higher education. Though that is one of the things that we wanted to do. So globalization is often thought as a process and a project that compresses time and space. It speeds up the flow of capital, information, people, and ideas, thereby creating new social relations and identities. From this point of view, the global is most of the time analyzed in its relation with the national and the local. But where is the body? The body in this common theorization of the global, the body is missing. Against this understanding that frames one of the dominant imaginaries of global higher education, the book problematizes key phenomena and discourses that I would like to talk about it now. The discourse promoting the advancement of the digital into higher education, the dominant discourses of internationalization, and affirmative action policies movement. Throughout the chapters, we have tried to queer the global and the international, exposing them as part of a disembodied, heteronormal, abstract, rational, and happy narrative that gloss over their exclusionary, elitist, and inequality practices. Beyond the Yale-Cambridge circuit of mobility that bonds the subjects of mobile transnational elite of knowledge governments, and beyond the exclusionary prestige of the label of the international or the global academic, we deploy the notion of queer as a gaze that troubles our attachments and investments into the normal. Unrelated formulations about time, the impossible, the migrant, heterosexuality, failure, and embodiment. In the chapters about internationalization and affirmative action policies, we deployed these theoretical notions and intuitions to show and problematize how academics and working class students in different territories were sexualized, classed, racialized, aged, and heteronormalized. And through these operations, excluded, marginalized, expulsed, made illegitimate and lacking subjects of higher education and knowledge. And whenever possible, we made visible when their bodily and affective experiences exposed those exclusionary operations, queer them, and show us possibilities to practice higher education, the global, and knowledge in other ways. Through, for example, the reclamation of their own non-normalized bodies, subjectivities, and joys of knowledge. No, stay there, yeah. I'm fine. Internationalization of higher education is depicted in our book as a contradictory and affective formation constituted through the racialized, privileged, and heterosexual underpinning of the global in diverse geographies, such in Chile, Japan, and South Africa. We call into question any normative and happy definition of internationalization, especially those that forget the body and let the heteronormative regimes to do their disciplinary work. So, for example, in the chapter about the digital economy, we saw and we identify multiple companies and international organizations promoting digital learning and digital teaching in order to disrupt and accelerate the labor of teaching in higher education by banding teachers to a constant disposition to be adapted, modified, and mobilized in a normative synchronity with economistic productivist, linear, consumerist, and personalized understanding of time, bodies, and knowledge. In the digital economy of knowledge, identities are anything but enforced becoming towards productive bodies belonging to the commodified space of the digital as a natural environment. And now, as a closing remarks, I think that several parts of this book invite to pursue lines of thinking that connect the body as a generative force of the global, beyond the global and the local. And through queer theoretical imaginations, we invite to position the body as a central locus of intersubjective and contested identities, bodily subjectivities, not fixed and fit for heteronormalities and hierarchical projects, can scandalize, as demonstrated in queer performances and feminist protests, where the body is a stake and a stage. So through this, we can scandalize the competitive, commodified, colonial, and patriarchal higher education of today. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Daniel. We're now going to invite Professor David Roubain to speak from the University of Sussex.
Thanks very much. Just to remind myself. Hang on, what do I do? Pardon? Yeah. Okay, thanks. Well, thanks very much, Louise and Daniel, for inviting me. My name is David Roubain. I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Culture, Equality and Inclusion at the University of Sussex. I'll just say by way of introduction, I think Louise and I met and I came across Cheer probably 8 years ago or so. At that point I was running something called Equality Challenge Unit, which was the UK higher education sector's equality and diversity and inclusion policy and research agency. And I say that because in reading the book, which I echo everything that Kelly says, perhaps inevitably I found myself reflecting on, thank you, the provocations and the thoughts through the EDI lens, and accepting very clearly and fully Louise's explanation of queer, particularly as a verb, and the translation of it, if you like, to broader issues of higher education. Nonetheless, I feel that this is the area of queer theory is one I know best in terms of EDI work. Probably if I was younger, if I hadn't been born in 1843, then I may have identified as queer myself. And in the context of EDI work, as I understand it, over the decades that I've been involved, it has played something of a marginal, but more recently a central role. So I wanted to say something about myself, not because this book is at all, or not that you should pay any attention to me, but really because of the context within which the remarks I want to make are centred. So I put their subject. I started off as I'm a disabled person, a noticeably disabled person, and I was born that way. And so in that regard, I have been thought of, conceptualized, critiqued, embodied, disembodied as a disabled person. And I suppose from a queering perspective, that has always been, whilst it might not have been the verb or the noun that I would have used about myself, it has always been the context within which I have understood my place in the world, and hence as an activist, because I think we all start off on our journeys in one form or another as an activist. That has been the case. I was a lawyer for 21 years, and I was a litigator, actually, so I sued people. Actually, I sued organisations, which is a fascinating thing to do, by the way, if you ever decide you want a different career path if you're not a lawyer already. It's great fun. And then moved into... I was an equality and human rights lawyer, first of all in private practice, and then at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, where I was Director of Legal Policy, which was about thinking about strategizing around public interest litigation and strategic litigation. And then principally because the impact of law is limited, I would say. I think it can make a big difference. One of the byways I went down when I was reading the book was the extent to which lawyers can be queered. I'm not sure they can, actually, but maybe that's the subject of another conversation. But I did see the law, whilst I found it very useful, as having limited impact in transformative work. And that's when I moved into strategy and policy work, then eventually in higher education. I suppose I am a poacher turned gamekeeper, and I say that in part because it's probably relevant for the context for what I have to say about the work of queering higher education. Next slide, please. So I wanted to reflect on the book from my perspective. I think it's, as has been said, an essential contribution and challenge to an increasingly stressed university operating model. And there's lots that could be said about that, and I'm sure we all have things to say about that if we're involved in higher education. Certainly the ever-increasing marketization, promulgation of operation is such that it makes it ever increasingly difficult to have outsider perspectives, observational or oppositional even perspectives. I don't think it's impossible, by the way, and I think that and I've observed that it is possible. But I think we need narratives and literature like this to challenge us. I don't need to say any more about extending queer theory beyond sexuality and gender, and critically to leadership. And I really like the use of the word abjection in the narrative, which appears quite frequently and I think helpfully, and queer as a critical edge. Affirmative action, which in this country, at least legally, from a legal point of view, is talked about as positive action. Positive discrimination is not lawful in the UK, although it has some purchase through, as Louise said, through the widening participation agenda, which actually does permit what some people might call some versions of affirmative action. I think that they can be disruptive, and I don't think that they're solutions to structural issues. And by the way, for reasons that I hope will become more evident, I do take a very structural analysis for exclusion, for oppression, for marginalisation, for underrepresentation or disadvantage. And I do think that affirmative action when operated well, can, perhaps in a queer way, be disruptive. But of course, as ever, the devil is in the detail. And I do also accept that there is a danger of aggregation or appropriation of EDI to neuter or even support an image or model of equality which is not real. There is no doubt about that, and I think what's interesting to me is the change in language and narrative over the decades, which is in part reflected in transformative change and in part not. And I think that requires a lot of care and consideration. As you will see when you read the book, there is a critique of counting, although I know Louise and I have talked about this, and I know that I think it's fair to say that Louise would accept it is important to know the numbers, but they are not an end in itself, evidently. And my own view is that quantitative and qualitative evidence of oppression is a necessary but not sufficient condition for change and for transformation. And I really, really liked the critique of meritocracy. It's in, as many of you will know, in a long line of critiques of meritocracy. In many respects, the neoliberal current propagation of meritocracy is, in my view, almost designed to embed current privilege. It's something that has been spoken about by many, Michael Young, many years ago in, I think it's I can't remember what his book was called, but it was The Rise of the Meritocracy, or something like that. And then others, Michael Sandel and Thomas Piketty and others more recently. Next slide, please. So I decided, this is my final slide, I decided to think about the challenge of convention and the call of heterodoxy, and some thoughts on queering and EDI. And these are just observations from reading the book. First of all, I do think, and I think it's probably quite topical, that identity is relational and not essential. We all have a variety of identities, but I think that they only, this is my proposition, they only exist in a context. They don't exist in a vacuum. I happen to be a gay, disabled, Arab Jew. And all of those identities are ones which are only meaningful in a context. Outside of a context, then they are irrelevant. And whether there was other, I'm also a man, and again, I think that's relational. And I'm lots of other things too. I'm also old, and that's relational. And I find that the essentializing of identity is becoming increasingly an obstruction to transformative change. I like the idea of heresy and identity. So there are lots of places where I feel heretical. For example, there is a narrative about lived experience, which is important, but the narrative extends, in some cases, to the only voices that should be heard in respect of a particular issue are those with lived experience of that issue. That does not make any sense to me anymore, at all, and we can talk more about that should that be helpful. Also, EDI work as transformative and not performative. The book talks a lot about the performative nature of EDI work, and I recognise that. And the interesting proposition for me is what is it that will really make the difference? What is it that is transformative and not performative? Although there is a role for performativity, nonetheless. Also, this idea, excuse the pun, but the idea, this kind of binary approach to being oppressor or oppressed. I think we all occupy, this perhaps relates to the earlier point, we all occupy multiple roles. And in certain respects, we can be either or both, or some nuanced complexity of the two. And And also the possibility of using conflict generatively to queer. Or perhaps that's the wrong way of putting it. Perhaps using conflict generatively is queering. And I see that as a very hopeful proposition. Whether or not EDI is a means or an end, I see it as a means more than an end. Clearly there are end goals of inclusion. I don't know if there is an end to inclusion. I think that it's a journey rather than a arrival point. But using it or thinking about it in that way allows us to constantly reinvent what it is that we're trying to achieve. And also, again, this insider-outsider proposition. And I definitely am an insider. It would be pretentious for me to say otherwise, but I hope from an outsider perspective. Can we queer or at least avoid the creation of new binaries? And as the authors write, as Louise and Daniel write, a further question is whether queerness vacates ontology and if its capaciousness means that everything and therefore nothing is queer. That is a really interesting question. I mean, there's much in there which is really interesting. And I would like to have as many arguments as I can about that. When I say arguments, I don't wish to fight, but I wish to wrestle. So to speak. And then this issue of structural and intersectional oppression. And finally, I've put the value of relationships, and this is my proposition, because I feel given my own journey, and somebody who, as I say, takes a structural view of disadvantage and all of the other ways of characterizing that, I actually have come to the point now that relationships are critical. Individual relationships are critical for transformation. Having thought about things in the different ways as I have had the opportunity to, through the law, really with some responsibility for legal strategy in Britain, through working with all universities across in Britain at least, and in some other countries as well, and now in one university. I think that there are many tools we can bring to the game, but individual relationships are perhaps the most potent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David.
Would you mind
That was
operating?
fantastic. You can
Thank
tell we're going to
you.
have a lot to discuss when we get to the Q&A, and we're very fortunate to have Emily Henderson with us from the University of Warwick. It's going to be our fourth speaker.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll set a timer. All right. And firstly, just thank you so much for the invitation. It's really nice to come back up, and Cheer has been a really important formative space for me over the years. I think it's a research centre unlike any other, actually, in terms of the feminism that runs through all of it. So thank you. And I also want to recognise the work, the labour that's gone into setting all this up today, seen and unseen. So thanks to all of you who've been involved. And in my intervention, I want to talk about queering processes. In some senses, I offer a queer reading of the book. I'm thinking about what are the processes of queering that the book enacts, but also the fact that the book itself represents something of a queering of knowledge production. So thank you. So I want to focus in particular on what this book does. You've heard a fair bit about what it's about, what it is, but I want to think about what it does. And I offer 5 queering processes that I have identified from the book. And I'll go through them one by one. So definitional politics, intertextuality, detaching queer from queer bodies and reattaching it, occupying borders inside and outside of higher education, and occupying borders of academic work. And I'll conclude asking, is there something still left to queer? Thank you. So firstly, definitional politics. Wherever you see a quote in purple, it's from the book. So I noticed that within the book was included this quote, "Queer theory's resistance to definition is strategic." And I think that's very interesting because the book also offers repeated definitional statements of queer. And I think that's kind of an interesting game to play, conceptual game. And it's a game that I've theorized elsewhere in relation to the concept of gender as definitional politics, where I've argued that each time gender is used, it's being mobilized to carve out or reinforce an area of thinking that, with or without intention, is being shifted and redetermined. And I noticed this happening a lot in the book in relation to queer. Queer, in fact, is incessantly defined in the book and redefined. And I find that that's a really interesting game, conceptual game to play around both defining and resisting definition, because after all, if you repeatedly redefine queer, you resist definition by doing so. So I think that's a really interesting thing. We come to many different kaleidoscopic understandings of queer through this book. So the second queer process that I pick up on is intertextuality, which is the idea that each text builds on other texts, that there's not really any such thing as a fresh text. All text is building on others. And I feel that this text, for those of you who haven't read it yet, is rich with references to other texts. It's almost encrusted with other scholarship. It's extremely deeply situated in many different other kinds of texts. And I feel, as I was reading it, I was thinking, this is doing something to me as a reader. And I was thinking of it actually as quite a queer process, I think. One way we could see it is calling in friends and allies, something which queers have had to do always to support and legitimize. I was thinking about it as proliferation, as directions of expansion, which queer offers as an identity. I was also thinking about plenty, generosity, and hospitality, that there's something about queer that allows for every taste, as well as promiscuity, fleeting desires in different theoretical orientations. Queer combinations, putting together things that you wouldn't see together in any other text necessarily. Facades and charades, trying out different costumes, different acts, different alignments. And even thinking what counts as the book or not the book. How much is this a material book versus an ephemeral set of relations to other texts? So if you take, for example, chapter 5, just reading across the different texts that are referenced and discussed, you have international organizations like OECD mentioned. You have theorists, queer theorists such as Puar and Halberstam, as well as more canonical theorists, if you like, such as Foucault. You have the authors drawing on each other, Leyton and Morley. And then you have also snippets from research projects, but it's not set out as an empirical chapter. They're sort of flung in as their own voices. An advocacy researcher appears, Julia appears. So I think there's something about this book that offers a queer text in and of itself. Next, thank you. So my third process that I've identified is detaching queer from queer bodies and reattaching it. And indeed, with kind permission of my partner, this is my partner having a nap while I was preparing my slides for this talk. And I was thinking, I'm writing about detaching queer from queer bodies, and yet there's my partner having a nap in her rainbow quilt, just right next to my screen. This book, as the authors have already discussed, sets out quite clearly that this is a project of not just looking at queer in relation to queer bodies. This can also be a theoretical understanding of queer that detaches queer in some ways from queer bodies and sees it as a lens, sees it in different directions. But there's something quite interesting that this book does. It constantly reattaches queer bodies again. I don't know if you're aware of that. So constantly coming back to the presence or absence of the queer body in the higher education situation. And I'm actually wondering if queer scholars can actually bear to detach queer entirely from queer bodies. I think in some senses, maybe we could say queer scholars have to detach it in some ways in terms of creating different avenues for thinking and moving beyond categories. But at the same time, I wonder if there's something slightly unbearable about detaching it completely. And maybe there's an impetus to come back to somehow come back to the body, the absent body each time. And I would just point to here chapter 4, which a maneuver the book constantly engages in is pointing out where LGBTQAI plus identities are invisibilized in higher education scholarship. So it's almost a reattaching, a pointing out of absence. So you can see here this quote. They point out that in these interviews around academic mobility, that that queer issues were rarely mentioned, with the exception of Jane, who related how gayness was othered. So pointing out silences and presences, and somehow detaching and reattaching the queer body. Thank you. So now I move on to 4 processes that are around the borders or the liminality. We often talk about queer as being somewhere around, blurring the edges, blurring the borders, being on the edge. And I feel this book plays at the borders of higher education. And it's something that certainly looking at decades of Louise's work that she's always done actually, is pointing out that higher education is in and of society, and society is in and of higher education. That that the people who live gendered lives on the streets don't leave their gender, for example, at the door of higher education. They bring it right in and carry on doing pretty much the same thing. And there's something here around actually occupying the academy as a queer person. That means that the personal and the private is brought into the public space of higher education. As a queer person, you know, as a visibly queer person, somehow your private life is somehow on show because people are always getting at it. And I'm wondering if it's kind of impossible not to, as a queer person, to see the public, to see the private and the personal within the public wherever you go. I feel that the book, the maneuver the book engages in, is a really interesting journey through analysing spaces. So I'm thinking of the COVID chapter, for example, where the book goes off into what it was like to work at home during the pandemic, no matter what job you do. It's not, you know, it's not always about higher education. And then the academics re-enter the scene, the students re-enter the scene. So the book constantly goes in and out of higher education as a space and links it together and reminds us that we can't just square off higher education and analyse it as a isolated, discrete place away from society. Thank you. And my final process, the borders of academic work. And thinking here what counts as an academic book. Queering Higher Education is clearly an academic book. It's published with a academic press in a series. It's formatted in that way. The tone of it is in that way. But I do think it plays at the edge of the genre, actually. And one of the ways it does that is by melding with other kinds of texts and sources and bordering on actually cultural analysis. So taking, for example, chapter 3, there's a passage which is about blogging and activism and kind of both using blog sources in the writing, but also critiquing them as both elitist and also thinking of them as transformative. And that's just a moment of the book that enacts this waving between the academic source and the informal blog space kind of source. So I think the book kind of waves in those ways as well. Thank you. Next slide. Nearly there. All right, so what's still to queer? Surely there must be some stuff. I have a couple of ideas. So firstly, I was thinking about authorial instability or stability. And I was thinking that in this book, the authors are curiously invisible in some ways, we might say. They're somewhat authoritative. They're sort of the reliable narrator. And they're quite stable. The voice is stable through the book. It is. This is how it comes across. but the book comes across in that way. And I was thinking about the potential and the risk of playing with the authorial voice in a book like this. You know, generations of feminist scholarship and queer scholarship has struggled with this. Do we in some ways signal academic knowledge production in order to gain legitimacy, or do we mess with it in order to mess with it but risk not being taken seriously? And certainly this book, as a clear reference book for the future of higher education studies, is definitely walking that line of the potential and the risk of play. And I think has taken a tone which is extremely convincing. So that's what that does. I was thinking concomitantly, really, about the reader at the same time. I was wondering who you're imagining as the reader as you were writing this. And I was feeling that the reader is probably also possibly quite stable, and I think certainly open-minded. I think, in a sense, the book doesn't hold your hand. It asks you to go along with it, be rearranged and arranged by it, and to just go with the theoretical ideas and texts that are, you know, it doesn't say, okay, you should be interested in this because. It just gets on and tells you what it's about. So I was thinking, again, what's the potential or risk of playing with the reader positionality? I think in that sense, again, it's the same potential and it's the same risk of legitimate knowledge production. So possibly this book could have, you know, included cartoons, songs, poetry, all sorts of things that might queer our experience as readers, but in a different sense that wouldn't make it the reference text that it is striving to be. So I want to end on the fact that this book includes, in the conclusion part, the idea that there's no endpoint to queer theory. Of course, at the same time, they've written a book which has concluded that, but has opened so much as well. And I guess what I just want to end on is the fact that I think there's something really important about the queering processes of this book that I've identified. I think that there's something in queer scholarship about the kind of deliberate use of strategies that open up notions of legitimacy. And when we start opening up legitimacy of a particular area of knowledge, such as queer theory, queering higher education, it opens up further possibilities, I think, to shift conceptions, to shift ideas. And with shifting concepts, shifting ideas, comes actually the possibility to open things up to more lives and ways of living. So a very erudite book at the same time, which opens up, I think, just the possibility for more lives to be lived better in higher education. So thank you very much.
Well done.
Bang on.
Thank you for fantastic talks. That was wonderful. Now we've got about half an hour for discussion. So we would like everyone to think about questions that you want to pose to the whole panel or a particular member of the panel, you say. As I said at the beginning, we've got a lovely online audience as well, about 20 participants. And you're very welcome to ask questions through the chat on Zoom, and we'll try to relay them to the panel. But I am going to turn to the audience now and give you the opportunity to speak. So is there anyone who would like to start? I'll keep looking online too, just in case, but okay, we've got someone at the back, I think. Did you put your hand up, or you put it up and took it down? I'm happy to do this if you like, but you do need to use the mic so the online audience can hear.
Okay, hi, thank you. So my question was kind of around, look, can you hear me okay? Yeah, I'll try. Okay, is that better? Okay. So my question is about, Louise, when you were talking about, I haven't read the book yet, but I am going to buy it. So I'm going to ask my team to buy it. when you're talking about unmasking some of the words that are used, like around inclusivity and diversity, and I guess my question was kind of around that, and I'm just going to say it and see if that makes any sense. I was wondering what you thought, or any of you thought, about what extent EDI teams or people with those kind of roles have the ability or capacity to queer the university, or does EDI inherently serve the normative power structure when the expectations often to fly flags and drive affirmative action work, write policies, etc. So can EDI be transformative? Can it run alongside transformative work, or is it working in opposition to transformative work?
Perfect. Louise, she directed it to you, but I know all of you are going to want to say something, I think. Go on.
Okay, I will start, but I think that everybody here can say something important about it. I know that it's a difficult question because most of the time, all those people around EDI work are struggling against the very strong institutions of higher education, which dates back to centuries in that way. So breaking up, overcome the elitism, the ableism of higher education, which seems to be inherent in the very same institution of universities, obviously it is a difficult task. And in my experience, most of the people that I've known that work in that field are very aware about the importance of querying. I mean, I assume that for them the book might be super interesting, but not surprising. They know. That's the first thing. And one of the things that I would like to maybe highlight about what is the possibility to do a querying work is embracing failure. Like around the book, there is a lot of ideas about failure as a resistance, as an embracing against, the idea of meritocracy and success in particular, and all the inequalities around those values. But when failure opens up the possibility to show the contingency and the arbitrariness of the knowledge and discourses that here in this very same room we're embracing, it is provocative and it can disrupt the ontological security of authors, or the authorial position of academics in that way. Embracing failure as an achievement, I know that it might sound counterintuitive, but I think that is a really good idea because I think that everybody can rely on failure. And everybody can rely on the ways in which we have been transformed ourselves in micro ways, when we fail, when somebody say that we fail in a way. But it is just because we are relying on other texts, other books, other knowledge. As a working class academic, I all the time rely on my own background, on my own stories, and those stories are difficult to put into the main text of the modules, in a way. They are not the canonical text. But certainly, they are the canonical embodied or bodily subjectivities that me and Louise, we have. So we work with it. I don't know. Around failure, I think that is a good idea to think about in a disruptive way. And I think that we can embrace it.
Very quickly. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Very, very quickly. Thank you very much for your question. We've been discussing that all week, actually, and I would suggest that EDI interventions are themselves queering interventions, because it's very much crossing a boundary, bringing the outside to the inside, as David was mentioning earlier. The whole history of social movements and activism has now been institutionalized, and some people would say incorporated. So on the one hand, it's a very positive move. It represents some sort of progress in political terms. But the downside of it is that it can be very symbolic and neutralizing and sanitizing. So David and I have talked a lot this week about statistical data. And we spent our early careers campaigning, so for example, to get gender disaggregated data collected. And now all over the world, they're saying, stop doing that. that's reinforcing a binary, and we shouldn't be doing that. So what we're saying in the book about EDI work, yes, we do need statistical data. We do need material evidence. But we actually have to look at the norms that get reinforced in that process. So if we're collecting gender disaggregated data, what are the categories that we're using? What are the categories we're using in ethnic monitoring, for example? So these are the sort of questions, so that we don't degenerate into a massive neoliberal marketing process that just uses EDI as another form of attracting clients and consumers. But we have to keep asking, what is actually changing? What is changing? And what is changing for whom? And who are the different constituencies who are involved? Because we've done organizational research for decades. And one of the main thing we've found, main findings, is that you get totally different readings in an institution, depending on who you're asking. So for how is EDI working? For whom is it working? And what is actually changing? And I'll hand you over now to our EDI Pro-Vice-Chancellor.
Well, I mean, Lindsay and I work together, so I should say that. I mean, it's a great question, and in summary, I agree. I agree with everything you've said. I think it is possible. I think EDI interventions within organisations, including universities, A, can be transformative, and B, can queer. And sometimes those things are the same, and sometimes those things are different. But what is also true is, particularly in the liminal, boundaried way of thinking about it, there are things that practitioners within organisations can't do. Because simply by virtue of operating within a rigid regulatory, legal, and structural and authoritative environment. So I don't know, the way I think about it is in terms of Venn diagram. So if you have a circle which is activists and a circle which is people who work or employed to do EDI work, they're overlapping but they're not coterminous. So there are things that activists can do that practitioners can't do, but there are things that practitioners, if that's not the wrong word, can do which activists can't do, because by virtue of them having some ability and authority to operate. So if what we mean by can we be queer is can we disrupt or blow up everything, answer is probably not. But if what we mean by that is reconstruct the narrative and bring about transformative change, then I personally do think we can.
I'm happy to take another question.
To take another question. Okay, we've got one online, if there's nobody's hand shooting up straight away. This is really related, and it's a really nice way of putting it, but Maggie writes, if EDI was transformative, it would be cancelled. And I almost feel like saying discuss. But you get the point. Queering is about disruption, as you were saying, David. So what might a queer agenda be for changing higher education? And I think that really resonates with me, because I was thinking, most all of you were talking about, and we referenced this a bit, early activism, early thoughts about, let's say, feminism in the university. I think one of the things that I felt when I was reading your book, the affective, was like that agenda is so, it actually made me feel a little bit like, not despairing, but just, I don't think we could do what we set out to do. And like our colleague here says, if you were going to transform everything, you'd be canceled. And so where does it leave us? Discuss.
Oh, I could start.
Yes, go ahead.
Just a couple of thoughts, really. I tend to think of this, there's a push and pull to all of this work. I did a piece of work around, if you look at the history of legislative change in Britain relating to advancing equality, howsoever you want to think of it, or beginning to address some aspects of oppression with, the first piece of legislation was the Race Relations Act 1965. That came in the context of a significant period of social action. And if you look at all legislative change or political change, it came in response to or alongside of wider social action and social movements. And there are push and pulls, and sometimes we move backwards, there's no doubt about that. But there is, I don't think anything is static, actually. So in that regard, I do think it's possible to make change, but it won't ever be neat, linear, or exactly what anybody may feel that they want it to be. The other small story I had is when I was at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, at the time when what became the Equality Act, which is the current foundational piece of anti-discrimination legislation in Britain, was a bill, and the work that we were doing in other words, it was being piloted through Parliament at the time. That was at the time of the last Labour government under Gordon Brown, there was a lot of work that we were doing. What should the bill look like? What should be the protected characteristics, which is what should be the identities? And there was a lot of lobbying going on about whether we should have X number of additional ones in there. And one of the provisions we talked about is whether to have class or socioeconomic status as a protected characteristic. And in fact, it is in there in sections 1 and 2, but not as an anti-discrimination provision. It's in there as a qualified public sector duty. And what I realized at the time was that if we were to have class or socioeconomic status, or howsoever you want to characterize it, as a thoroughgoing protected identity, you'd end up having the end of neoliberalism, if not the end of capitalism, because what you're effectively doing is embedding in law, or logically you would have that, you would embed in law the recognition of the structural way in which classism operates. And that was never going to happen. And in fact, what's interesting is first of all, it wasn't in the bill, because it just was never going to happen. But even the fairly limited aspects, the public sector duty on socioeconomic disadvantage in sections 1 and 2, was in the bill. It was passed by, as I say, the then Labour government in April 2010. In May, a month later, there was a general election and there was a new government, ended up being a coalition government. And one of the first things they determined was that they would not implement sections 1 and 2. So it's in the Act, but it's not implemented. And make of that what you will. But I think if you're looking for a New Jerusalem overnight, I agree. I don't think that's possible. We'll get cancelled, maybe, if one wants to characterize it that way. But I do think progress is possible.
Emily, did you want to? Yeah.
Sure. Thank you very much. Just a quick tangent, and then I'll say what I was going to say. But I always find it really interesting when we think in the UK context that certain things aren't possible, and then I think about India as the country where I have the most specialist expertise, and caste is not at all the same as social class, but there's a strong interlinkage there, and the quota system in the Indian public sector and higher education institutions, etc., does indeed legislate for basically 50% of the places in higher education being reserved for disadvantaged groups. And there it is. So I always think it's in which country's mentality are things possible or not. And of course, it's hugely contested. But the point I was also thinking about when thinking about this is transformation possible. I was thinking about the human subjects of EDI work and the extent to which it's possible to both be queer, and I take queer really openly here to include anyone who feels or performs some kind of non-normativity, if you like, can be recognized as legitimate agents of change in a more normative higher education environment? Is it that in order for EDI work to bring about change, it has to, in a way, be enacted by normative subjects? I'm wondering if it's possible to be a non-normative subject and bring about real disruptive queer change, or does one need to be received in a certain way in order for that change to come across? And that's kind of just a reflection from some of my own experiences of being, I mean, I'm hardly particularly radical in many ways, but I think can be read as disruptive in various situations, the way that I perform my gender, and I think it can lead to ears being closed to the content of what I'm saying. And of course, the problem is that if you think, okay, you have to be in some way normative looking, sounding, whatever that means in higher education for the message to get through, of course the message then becomes normative in its own right because of the way it's being delivered. So I feel there is an impasse there that we have around who can enact that transformative change, and if the only person who can enact that is someone quite normative, that already reduces the transformative potential. So I do feel a little bit stuck in that, but I'm not going to give up, and we shouldn't give up. Yeah.
No, let's not give up.
Thank you for the question, Maggie. I would like to take issue with the construct of cancelling, because the very notion of cancelling suggests there's a dominant other who has the power and the potential to cancel. So if EDI were truly successful and transformative, there wouldn't be this dominant other who could step in and cancel. So I think there's a big question here about what is the end point for EDI, and is there a danger of getting back on a very linear trajectory and moving away from all the queering that we've suggested and proposed in the book?
Just a few lines to add to that. It's like, I think that it's important to ask for what are the forces, desires, and interests that are making circulate cancel as an accepted, valid, strong idea, as you said, Louise. That all the time we lost those questions, and we feel that we don't have the time to go deeper into the very the circulation of capital, institutions, money, interests, colonial interests, etc., that are circulating this cancel as a strategy. And also, what are the bodies reclaim when emancipatory transformation is cancelled? Most of the time, if you look around, like in the internet, what I see is a binary reclaim all the time, a binary body. There are a lot of questions difficult to answer from powerful organizations. They're asking you, okay, so what is a woman? What is a man? And from our point of view, those are hard, difficult questions to answer, because the moment you answer those questions, you are validating the binary. So that's the body reclaimed in those cancel, when somebody's trying to cancel the emancipatory transformation. And also, another question that I think that has been going on for a long time, and within UK universities, we haven't discussed deeply that, and I think that we are late already, about what are the notion of academic freedom that we might enact in order to enable critical, democratic discussions about things that put people anxious, like when we reclaim our own fuzziness, our own blurriness of our identities and bodies, for example. But at the same time, what is the possibility to enact a notion of academic freedom that recovers the story of academic freedom, which was at the beginning called into action in order to enable the freedom of academics to engage with society outside, and not just within the walls of universities. So in that way, maybe the things that are going on here might be publicly, known, accepted, not, or the very queer action might be something that a lot of people might desire, rather than just fear. I don't know. That's one of those reflections that I have.
Very good. Thank you. Rebecca, you've got a question?
Thank you. Hi, thank you for a very beautiful book. It's been fantastic watching it come to fruition. I think perhaps because I'm an accountant, I'm quite excited by the frisson of tension between Louise and David over numbers. I do think, David, you're right. Very, very clearly and obviously stated that actually identities are relational and they're not essential. But it's also a characteristic of kind of mainstream numbers, and for accounting and indeed for law, that it's necessary to categorise, to essentialise people in order that law and accounting, statistics, etc., can operate. And of course, this is used as an operation of power, and particularly in sort of neoliberal times, accounting in particular is used in that way to frame things and to control things and to facilitate that operation of power. And I think you see that particularly, I think, at the moment, the rather toxic trans debate, so-called debate, trans arguments, whatever, where what I've been noticing is a demand that in order to have stable numbers, stable statistics, in order to have the stable operation of power, it's absolutely necessary to essentialise people, particularly around sex and gender. So you can see there the way in which numbers and indeed the law is used to push for a requirement for that. And but there is an answer. Although I may be an accountant, I'm what's known as a critical accountant, and if accountants didn't have that sort of essential characteristic of accountingness, we'd probably call ourselves queer accountants, because, but we don't, because we're accountants. But critical accounting, queer, let's call it queer accounting, really seeks to do what queer studies does, to disrupt, to reinterpret, to challenge, to push boundaries and so on, and to disrupt that kind of operation of power. So I'd like to ask you both whether you think it's possible to use that notion of queer accounting, not to reject numbers and say we collect too many, but to actually say we really need to disrupt, and you started to hint at it, Louise, we need to start to disrupt how numbers are framed and how numbers are used. And I'd suggest that if we could move in that direction in EDI, you might find EDI capable of being a much more queer activity, a much more disruptive activity. I'm sorry to ask you about numbers, that's horrible.
Very interesting. Thank you. Who would like to tackle that one first? David likes to talk about numbers.
Okay. Well, what a great question. Thank you. I don't know if I can answer the question other than I find myself agreeing with what I think you're reaching for. So we, from a legal and a regular, I suspect that the kind of the boundary position that you're describing about accountants, which I don't know about, but I'm hearing you, I'm understanding, probably feels quite similar to law, which I do know about, obviously, and certainly it's important it's obvious, and probably there's little disagreement about this, but it's important to be able to know the numbers, even to unpick the experience of oppression. So, for example, there is a legal obligation to publish on large organisations to publish gender pay gaps. There is not a legal, but a good practice obligation to do the same on ethnicity and disability, which we do, and many organisations do. And there is an interesting discussion now in the university. Why don't we look to do that around LGBTQ? What is the pay gap issue there? And I think we need to look, but I suspect we will find not helpful information because of the heterogeneity of the identity, if nothing else. And also because of some qualitative research that we did at Equality Challenge Unit some years ago, which showed that the experience of oppression was less about occupational segregation, which is sort of what underpins a lot of the gender pay gap, and more about the qualitative experience of being queer or LGBTQ and how that can make people not be able to bring their full selves to work. So we should count so that we know what isn't as much as what it is. But I suppose where it might be queer is that it's not the counting bit is not the end point. We're not finding out numbers so that we just know numbers. It's because, like qualitative and other kinds of information, they inform our granulated understanding of oppression, basically. So I'm a fan of counting, but as a means to an end rather than an end in itself.
Just, yeah, we'll be very, very brief here because we're running out of time. I would say 2 points. One point is that I have noticed through all my international work on gender that this is often a strategic device that policymakers, governments, institutions use in order to massively detract from some of the core issues. So I've been at conferences, seminars all around the world where every presentation is a bar chart. Okay, so we get to hear all about, you know, the wonderful Nordic countries because they've got whatever. So there is that I think is really very important. And as I said earlier, that my concern is that statistical data are used in a very crude way in terms of ontology as epistemology, and people just their whole aim is to count more in, whether it's women in STEM, women in leadership, whatever, okay. And it's very, very reductive and a massive distraction from what we were talking about earlier, the micropolitical, and how power circulates in everyday processes. So there's that point. The other point that has been very hotly contested is what sort of categories do we use? And I perhaps need you, Susan, to help me out here as our criminologist here. But and it's often been very misinterpreted. So, for example, David and I have spent decades begging people to collect statistics, say around gender. Now that has been disputed because the statistical categories are very reductive. So some people will not be happy to identify as male or female, but equally they don't want to be put in a category of other, or just non-binary or whatever. So the discussion has to be very nuanced and very sensitive, and we have to stop. We're in danger, if you like, of creating another binary of collecting or not collecting statistical data. And it's another one of those areas that needs a lot of nuanced, sensitive discussion and debate. And as we were saying in our book, there is no immediate endpoint in sight.
Can I just add one other thing? Yes, because, I mean, I completely agree with that. And actually, obviously, as I've mentioned, as you will see, I'm a disabled person. The fact that I have a position of authority in the university does not mean that we get everything right around disability. So the just counting thing, or if the ambition is we need X% of people of this identity enrolled, and once we've got that, that's the end of it. I completely agree with Louise's point. It is entirely reductive, but it is of some evidential value.
I just wanted to add something in here, a couple of things maybe. I think one thing is around what we're counting. I think that's already been said, but I think actually there's some really fantastic work out there by people like Michael Woodford about how you can represent gender and sexuality in more inclusive ways in instruments that really does actually try to do this, so that, you know, I think some homework and some thinking about this kind of thing, how it's taught in methods courses, could also be extremely helpful actually, and sometimes also just thinking about what's counted. You know, for instance, we talk about gender parity in higher education being solved or even over dominated by women in the feminization crisis, but, you know, actually there's a lot else to count other than undergraduate parity of enrollment. You know, there's actually lots of things around higher education choice that we're not counting that actually mask a lot of persistent gender inequalities. So I think there's like a couple of things there. But there was one other thing I wanted to think about, an angle here, which I think is a queer angle. I think queer people often have to be shapeshifters, in society, and have to adopt different performances, different embodiments in different situations in order to navigate queer social life. And I think that sometimes taking different analytical approaches can go along with a queer embodied life. I guess I'm just thinking through, because I was vehemently anti-numbers, but I've been kind of forced into it to an extent through my, specifically my work in India, where stats has just got to happen. And I'm writing a book at the moment with colleagues in India, and we start with a degendered analysis of access to higher education, and then we do a disaggregated analysis of higher education, and it shows so much that is missed from a degendered analysis. And then we move into an analysis of femininities in higher education and masculinities in higher education, and try to detach them from male and female bodies. So we move through a process. Each chapter unfolds a different gender analysis. And I think there's something that we need to acknowledge here, that we don't have to all be wedded to an approach that has to be the truth. I think as shapeshifters, we can lay out, here's this analysis, here's what it looks like. You can lay out a binarized disaggregated analysis, then you can lay out a more queer sensitive disaggregated analysis. You don't have to stick with one rule book. You can keep moving the rule book, and as long as you acknowledge why you're doing what you're doing and explain it, like I think we should be doing it. So yeah, that's my impassioned response.
Fantastic. We are running up against time. So I think in the interest of moving on to the wine reception, what I'd really like to do, because we do want to socialize and continue talking about the book, and you can see that it is a very thought-provoking book, can I just ask Louise and Daniel to say really briefly, what is the key message for each of you that you would really like the audience to take home about the book and what it's saying?
Stability, fluidity, very contradictory concepts. And I was going to talk about your comment on caste and class and how different they are, caste and class. And one of the big issues about identity, particularly identity politics, is that it often assumes a stability and reification of identity that doesn't lend itself to thinking queerly.
Perfect.
So clear. I don't know if I have a key message, but it resonates. It resonates with my head, taking into account the discussion about data, that what if we try to stop being so focused on capturing identities? That's what most of the surveys culture does, no? Like, they're trying to capture, no matter complex, whatever, or binary identities, they try to capture all of them. But what if we think about a production of knowledge that is not concerned with capturing identities, but rather capturing the real fluidities? And we stop also not taking serious, or just part of just a particular portion of the population that experience fluidity. So there are a lot of experiments about data that they recognize that every type of people recognize the difficulties to categorize themselves in different categories, identities all the time. So it is part of our everyday life, the fluidity, the blurriness, like the fluidity of our identities, subjectivities, and bodies all the time. So there are others and other institutions that put us the boundaries that we use, no? So I don't know, that's the key message. Stop fixations.
Lovely. Thank you so much. We're going to be fluid now and flow into our drinks reception. But can I thank everyone who helped make this possible? And can I most especially thank the panel for a really rich and fascinating discussion. And yeah, if you don't want to buy the book now, I don't know what's happened to you over the past hour and a half. So thank you so much, everyone. And thank you online.